This is presentation number 13 in our series, Rereading the Fourth Gospel, the story of Jesus the Revealer. And the title of today's presentation is Revelation as Judgment. Our previous presentation was called Revelation as Salvation. And these terms, this landscape is fluid, it flows together. These terms, revelation as judgment and revelation as salvation, are actually both true. Now, for the judgment theme in the book, we will look at this book by Andrew Lincoln, or I will draw on it just to get us started. Andrew Lincoln, a British New Testament scholar who wrote a book called Truth on Trial, the lawsuit motif in the Gospel of John, or in the fourth Gospel. And this book is highly regarded. It draws on previous works that have also explored the judgment theme. And just look at the language. Just look at how the Gospel of John teems with judicial terms. Judge, the notion of judge, or the verb, krino, more than 10, I think about 15 about at least more than 10 verses. Here, judgment, krisis, more than 10. Here, the notion of witness, martyria, the noun, more than 10 verses. And here, the verb to witness, martyreo, about 30 verses. So the language of judgment is all over the place in the Gospel of John. And we have a scene here where the judgment, where you have witnesses as if in a court situation. It's like we are in a judgment hall, and there are witnesses, there is judge, there is a real trial going on, and someone in the witness stand. Who is on trial? Well, in Andrew Lincoln's conception, truth is on trial. And the truth that is on trial is connected with the person of Jesus. So Jesus is on trial. And sure enough, when he confronts Pilate, when he is pulled before the Sanhedrin, he is actually on a real trial. Not just made up stuff, not just sort of submerged in the gospel otherwise, but it is out there in the open. His followers are also on trial. Like the man who was born blind, who is pulled in and interrogated after he has been made into seeing again. And then the accusers also are on trial, because the table turns, and Pilate, he will question Jesus, and about halfway or early on in the trial, Jesus starts asking his interrogator. He puts him on trial, and you can sense Pilate's discomfort, because the judge is not supposed to be on trial before the defendant. That is turning things upside down. And the man who was born blind, he puts his accusers on trial too. So many levels of trial here, and one more level. Because who else? In all of this, throughout all of this, we have echoes of Eden. We have the beginning of the story. We have the statement heard in the Garden of Eden here in Lucas Cranach's, in a close-up from Lucas Cranach's depiction. We have that echo of an accusation against God. Did God say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? Did God say that? And this suggestion that even though God did not say that. God said something that puts God in a bad light, and sure enough, they will eat. And they will eat on the assumption that God has withheld something that was good. And the Gospel of John is concerned about this and wants to remedy it. And Jesus will, in the Gospel of John, call the serpent the father of the lie and the ruler of this world. Those are the things. Those are that shadow, or those echoes of Eden resonate in the Gospel of John. And in fact, they become not echoes. They are like thunder peals, loud in the story as premises. Here, let's review. We have been here before. This is the paralytic by the pool. This is the woman caught in adultery in Rembrandt's representation. And this is the man born blind, as El Greco depicts it. And let's listen in. The man by the pool says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up." What do we have here? We have the sense of God's absence. In fact, the sense that everyone is absent. The sense of being abandoned. That's what we have. And I call that a thunder peal from Eden, because that representation of God, the absent God, the God who withholds good from us, that is now, we are sort of catching up, or we are getting an update on that impression. And here, with the woman caught in adultery, the person, one of her accusers, will say to Jesus, "Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" And he is representing religion. He is representing God. He wishes to execute according to a theological script here, an impression of the kind of person God is. I call it a thunder peal from Eden. The notion of a punitive God, the absent God, the punitive God. And then in the healing of the man born blind, they will say, it's his disciples who say it, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And I struggle to find a way to describe it. This is the best I came up with. This is the detached view of the human predicament. A God who is absent, a God who punishes, or a God who is detached. And into this situation, Jesus takes the witnessing stand. And we read, "For this reason I was born, and for this purpose I came into the world, to testify to the truth of a present God, the truth of a God who isn't punitive, and the truth of a God who is not detached." These are big ticket items. And the language of testimony is also the language of glorification, or to testify and to glorify are words that arise from the same script. I glorified you on earth by completing the work you sent me to do. Jesus in the witnessing stand there to glorify God and to testify on God's behalf against the misrepresentation of God in Eden and its aftermath, in the way our thinking about God has been shaped. So here you can see it, the vocabulary of testimony or of witness. Here, martyreo, all those verbs. Here, martyria, all those nouns. And here, glorify, doxazo, and doxa, all those words to show how God wants to make right what has gone wrong. And in some ways, Jesus then giving testimony on God's behalf and putting the ruler of this world out of commission, as it were. And we read this in our previous presentation, and we can read it again. Now is the judgment, the crisis of this world. Now the ruler of this world, the father of the lies, will be expelled. The Paraclete will correct the world concerning sin and righteousness and judgment. About judgment, because the ruler of this world has been judged. Now, I'd like to slowly walk us through a little more of that text in John chapter 12. So Jesus will say the ruler of this world will be expelled, and then he tells us how. And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And this triggers a conversation. The crowd answered him, "We have heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man?" I have skipped a few verses here, and then Jesus specifies where the concept of lifting up comes from. Where did he get it? Isaiah said this because he saw his glory and spoke about him. So here we have Jesus using a term, lifted up, the listeners hearing that term and seizing upon it, and Jesus saying, well, I'll get this from Isaiah. And here is Michelangelo's depiction of Isaiah in the Sistine Chapel. Of course, it is all fictitious, but he is a looming presence in that depiction. We have looked at Richard Hayes' work already in a previous presentation, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, and he notices that in the Gospel of John uses the Old Testament somewhat different from in the Synoptics. He uses symbols more than specific quotations. He kind of kneads it into a dough, as though he is baking a bread, and all the ingredients they sort of flow together, and that is certainly the case in what we are going to look at here. So John engages Israel's scripture chiefly as a source of symbols. He often references the biblical stories not through direct quotation, but through allusions and echoes. And there is this family of passages in the book of Isaiah. They are often referred to as the suffering servant passages. Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 50, and Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. And this lifted up passage, the lifted up passage is taken from this last one of the so-called servant songs. Let's see how that could be woven into John's composition, how he uses it. So here we have a bruised reed, he shall not break. I am reading from Isaiah 42, a bruised reed he shall not break. And we could see that sort of echoing somewhat here in the story of the paralytic at the pool. Jesus comes on a healing mission to that man. That's a soft echo, just barely audible. But this one, Isaiah says he will be a light to the nations. And sure enough, Jesus will say in John 8:12, I am the light of the world. So there it goes. He has come to open the eyes of the blind, Isaiah says. And sure enough, in John 9, he opens the eyes of the man born blind, and he tries to open the eyes of other people who have spiritual blindness or problems with their spiritual eyesight. He says in Isaiah, they shall not hunger, neither shall they thirst, in Isaiah 49:10. And Jesus says to the woman at the well that you will never thirst again if you drink this water. And they shall not hunger again. And Jesus says after feeding the 5,000 that I am the bread of life, and those who eat this bread will not hunger again. And then Isaiah says, he who has mercy on them will lead them. And it is shepherd language, the shepherd leading the flock. And Jesus in John 10, he is the good shepherd. So you see how these images from the servant songs are scattered all over and sort of appropriated, but they're sort of inside it. You can't just see it right away. You have to go looking for it. In Isaiah, all over, he is the messenger and revealer, as he will be in the Gospel of John. And there is a notion of judgment in Isaiah. Several verses here talking about judgment. He's coming to judge. The Hebrew word is mishpat, and the Greek word here is crisis. But the character of the judgment is someone who reveals. It's a revelatory judgment, not just judicial. And it is a right-making judgment, not just observing, describing, and passing a sentence. So these terms, before the concept of judgment arrives in the Gospel of John, it has already been primed in a sort of restorative sense in the book of Isaiah. And this will change God's standing in the world. You are my servant, in whom I will be glorified. The world's impression of me, the world's view of me, of God, will change when he appears, and then he shall be lifted up. That is the term we want to look at a little more, as the kind of clinching evidence, this sort of clincher in the whole thing. Jesus says, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And we have located that term in Isaiah. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up, they say. And then Isaiah said this because he saw his glory and spoke about him. And we have now shown that Isaiah saw the glory of this figure widely, and John, the Gospel of John has picked it up. So I'm reading now in the Septuagint translation of the text in Isaiah, just because those terms, John is written in Greek, and the Septuagint is a Greek version of the Old Testament. So I just want to show the words here, how the vocabulary in Isaiah is similar to the Gospel of John. Behold, my servant shall understand, and be lifted up and glorified. So there we have the terms lifted up and glorified exceedingly. By the manner in which it happens, many shall be astounded at you. That is as though God is speaking to the servant. That is, your appearance seemed without glory. He was disfigured, the Hebrew text says. Here it is a little more abstract. Your appearance seemed without glory, unworthy of respect to human sight. And your glory was not recognized as glory by humans. This is showing how how the servant is manhandled, as it were. But even in his humiliation, there is a type of glory. That's what he will say. Nevertheless, in spite of this strangeness of this, he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall understand. This is a scene of revelation. This scene here is a revealing, a revelatory scene. And one of the great Old Testament scholars of our time, Klaus Balzer, he explains what we are reading. There is something to be seen. The servant will understand, and he is able to make others discerning too. That's in our text here. And then he says, the scene is set in a court of law. It's a trial scene, where a dispute about the view to be taken of a certain person is under consideration. Those present are the judge, the person in question, witnesses brought in by the disputing parties, and listeners. So we have a full court scene here in the background text in Isaiah. And in the Gospel of John, we have a trial going on. And in that trial, the highest evidence comes when Jesus is lifted up. It throws out, it puts to shame the ruler of this world, and it glorifies God. It vindicates God, as it were. And Jesus, in an earlier exchange in the Gospel of John, he will say to his critics, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am he. I am the one described in those servant stories. And I have been at my work all the time, and you will see it finally. When you have lifted up the Son of Man, you will realize that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own. So Revelation as judgment continues in a somewhat different direction. Maybe you could say that there is a separate horizon here, and we will look at how that plays out. We will begin in the story of the healing of the blind. At the end of that story, very, very end, Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now you say we see. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. So here, just as another language lesson, another sort of seeing how these terms are used, usually when we talk about judging and judgment, we mean pronouncing a verdict, having a trial and judging at the end of the trial. That is not absent in the Gospel of John, but it isn't the main thing, and it certainly isn't the distinctive thing in the Gospel of John. So we have this option too, to make a judgment based on taking various factors into account. Judge, think, consider, look upon. And I have highlighted the word consider. To judge as considering something. And then this one, come to a conclusion after a deliberative process. Reach a decision. Here you consider, and here you decide. And those are judgment concepts in the Gospel of John, not simply the conventional notion of judging. So, this is Bultmann commenting on the passage in John 9. Once again, the coming of the revealer into this world is described as judgment. And according to this saying, the judgment consists in a radical reversal of the human condition. The blind will receive sight, and the seeing will become blind. And I will comment on it the following way. I came for judgment. Is judgment understood as revelation? Try that out, and we'll see if it stands up to scrutiny. The revelation, the judgment, has as its goal to reverse things, to change things, and to make a blind person into a seeing person, whether it's physical or spiritual. And then sin is defined and reckoned in relation to how one responds to the revelation. Are we blind? They say here in our text. And Jesus says, if you were blind, you would have no sin. So revelation is what changes it and what creates sin, as it were, and this is very strange. Here is another text. We will walk through a few more of these texts and close with one that is really, really strange. So here is one. This is in the tail end of Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Those who believe in him are not judged, but those who do not believe are judged already, because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. So here revelation comes, and it is a form of judgment. But Jesus says this, specifically, I did not come to judge. So the conventional notion of judgment doesn't work for this. A revelatory notion of judgment works perfectly fine. And we can say then that the conventional view is this one, and Jesus dissents from the conventional view, the one of God as judge. And then we have he follows through with another state or with a follow-up thing, and this is the judgment. This is revelation and resonance, revelation and response. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into this world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. And I hope I can get this illustration to work. Here you see the person waiting for the revelation. And the revelation comes. And the person responds to the revelation by hiding his or her face. That is the judgment. That is how these things are described. So there is a judgment scene here, and it isn't that very flattering. This illustration is not very flattering. Is that what happened when the light shone, when the revelation came? Here in John 5, this is after the healing of the paralytic, the discussion that takes place after that. And Jesus will say, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Anyone who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Very truly I tell you, anyone who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has eternal life and does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. So here we have God who doesn't judge. He has outsourced the whole thing to Jesus, and Jesus' notion of judgment is to be a revealer and make light shine into our lives. And then the judgment at the end then is in some ways cancelled. It all happens in the present. That's what we are seeing here. And Rudolf Bultmann, who can be faulted for many things, should not be faulted for the way he understands the revealer and the revelation he brings in his commentary on the Gospel of John. I do think that he has some admirable insights. Unbelief, by shutting the door to God's love, turns his love into judgment. For this is the meaning of judgment, that man shuts himself off from God's love. There would be no judgment at all were it not for the event of God's love. And with the mission of the Son, this judgment has become present reality. Not the judgment at the end there, the judgment here in present tense, as it were, when the revelation comes. Judgment is for him nothing more nor less than the fact that the light, the revealer, has come to this world. This saving event is judgment, for the reason that men, by which he again means men in general, have shut themselves off from the light. So the revelation and the response to the revelation, this is what comes here in the concept of judgment. After the story of the woman caught in adultery, here in John chapter 8, and that's William Blake's illustration, you judge superficially, he says to the people who have maybe participated in that scene, you judge superficially, according to the flesh is the way it is in the Greek. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid. For alone I am not, but I and the Father who sent me. So the reticence of judgment in a traditional sense is strong in this word, and the notion of judgment is primarily revelation. We are now in chapter 12, in that pivotal chapter where Jesus will be lifted up and where he will throw out the ruler of this world. And then in the end of that chapter there are some scenes of stupendous clarity. Then Jesus cried aloud, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world, so that everyone who believes in me should not remain in the darkness. And if anyone hears my word and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Same thing as in John chapter 3. Same wording. I did not come to judge the world. And yet there is judgment. I came into the world as revelation. I have come as light into the world. These are strong and striking and counterintuitive the terms for what is happening here. Because we do have that other verse, don't we? Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. But it is judgment as revelation, clearly. And there is no disharmony, there is no conflict between those statements if we say that the judgment is revelation. The one who rejects me, reading on in chapter 12, the one who rejects me and does not receive my word has one who will judge him. On the last day, the word that I have spoken, that word is what will judge him. For I have not spoken on my own, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment about what to say and what to speak. And here it is as though we are present at the final judgment, and there is no judge here in the seat. The only thing in the judgment seat is that word that was spoken in the world. That word is what will judge him. It is strange terms. And there is one that is even, a couple more that are even stranger. I guess this one could be the most strange one. Listen to this one in John chapter 15. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have sinned. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not have sin. But now they have seen me and hated both me and my Father. It was to fulfill the word that is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. And here we have a before and after. The before is before Jesus came. The after is after he came. And what does he say? He says that in the before state there was no sin. And in the after state there is sin. If I had not come and had not spoken, they would not have sinned. But he did come. And after he came, the possibility of sin, something that is reckoned as sin, appears. So the usual paradigm, of course, is that before Jesus came, there are sins and sinners, and he comes to solve the sin problem. And after he has been there, he has solved it. So the sin problem has been solved. But that is not what he is saying here. Here he is saying that before he came, there was whatever the state of the world, it didn't count as sin. But now after he has come in the wake of Revelation, there could be sin. It depends on the response to the revelation and the revealer. Bultmann says sin, therefore, is not primarily immoral behavior. It does not consist in any particular action, but it is unbelief. And it will be defined as such explicitly in 16:8. What counts as sin here then challenges us. The Gospel of John has a radically different view of sin. Its perspective on sin is definitely a new perspective. So, looking again at the motifs in this Gospel, trial motif, the witness, the jury, the judge, and then a verdict certainly on the ruler of this world. We see all these conventional images transformed in this gospel, because it is in this conversation with Nicodemus that Jesus will say that God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world. And it is in the aftermath of the healing of the paralytic at the pool that he will say the Father judges no one. And it is here in the healing of the man who was born blind that Jesus will have a conversation about judgment as revelation that turns the blind into seeing people, and also the seeing people to make them blind. Let's do our retrospective. Revelation as judgment. In this book, judgment means revelation. And in response to the revelation, decision. We saw that the words can mean to consider and to decide. Don't leave that out. It is to come to a conclusion after a cognitive process to reach a decision. This moves the judgment from a point in the future into the present. It happens now, whenever revelation makes its presence felt in our lives. More than once in this book, Jesus says, I did not come to judge the world. Those of us who think of God primarily as a judge are enticed, are invited to think again. There are trials on every corner in this book of Jesus, of his followers, of his accusers, and even of readers, that we may see ourselves in the characters in the book, and we may see ourselves as the jury, adjudicating the truth claims of one side or the other in the book. the language of judgment in John is strange, I admit that. On God's side we have a revelation that for me becomes the moment of judgment. And if the language of judgment in John bewilders, it does bewilder. It is unambiguous on one point. The ruler of this world has been judged.